You're watching In Search of Fun. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to In Search of Fun. We haven't done a video for you in a while. We had a great time in Italy, and then we thought ski season was going to start. We get a lot more content for you recently. That has not been the case. Fortunately, Mount Bachelor is opening tomorrow, and we have a bunch of fun ski stuff and other trips to come after the holiday. But it's been a little quiet here in Bend. It's been a little bit quiet in the Ceccarelli house, and that has meant we've had a lot more time for reading. And in going back and reading some new books and reading some of my favorites, I stumbled back into one of my favorite authors, John Williams, one of the great American authors. And I read through his book, Butcher's Crossing. I read through his book, Stoner again. And now I'm back into his third book, Augustus. And it really inspired me to talk a little bit about who John Williams was. You know, for me, he was an author that I only came to know in the last couple of years. And he's somebody that I've really come to love a great deal. And I've got here today with me JC, my brother, another very, very big literary fan, who is also a fan of John Williams. JC, thanks for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to talk about Butcher's Crossing here today and John Williams in a more general sense. I've not read Augustus. That is on my list. I've gotten through 32 books this year, so that'll probably be front and center as we flip the calendar to 2026, and Goodreads eventually gives me my year wrapped. That's, of all like the data science ones, a company owned and powered by Amazon, I'd feel like they would get that kind of right away, but it just keeps giving me the coming soon, maybe
yeah.
in the future at some point.
Yeah, I actually have been putting together my favorite TV shows, favorite movies, and favorite books. I got to 23 books this year, I want to say, if I have that right. And I have some favorites to share as well. But certainly a couple of the books that are going to be on that list are not new books in 2025, but are John Williams books. And we'll talk about Butcher's Crossing in a second, which is his first great American novel, the book that really put him on the map. But first, I want to talk a little bit about who is John Williams. Before we get into his whole upbringing, he was somebody that gained his love of books and of reading from his mom. And that's something that you and I shared. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mom and how she inspired your love of reading? Because you are one of the most voracious readers that I know, as is your niece and my daughter, Olivia, who also got that love of reading from her mom.
Yeah, I mean, going back to even when Mom was a kid, the way that she was punished was she had her books taken away because she would always be found in a corner, in a cupboard, just reading. And growing up, I mean, I was a huge gamer growing up. Some might say I even had a problem, but it's only a problem if you go to meetings. And Mom was always trying to find books that I would like. She was trying to channel me towards learning. And I think like a lot of kids who just haven't discovered that you can read for fun, I didn't like reading what the schools taught me. So she turned me on to James Patterson and Dan Brown were the two that it was the Women's Murder Club, and then it was all the Dan Brown books, and then Alex Cross, and she had read all of those. So you remember.
Can I give our dad a shout out here? Because for me, it was Clive Cussler. Mom got me into a lot of books, and certainly those two authors are two of them. But Dad also was like, hey, you know what? You might like this character, Dirk Pitt. And I read a bunch of Clive Cussler books too.
That was Stephen Hunter for me, and Bob Lee Swagger, the former Marine sniper that was just a grizzled badass. So we got it from both sides, and then Mom was just always there. Do you want to go to the library? Do you want to go to the bookstore? Like, that was one of the few things that had like clothes, because I wore clothes until they were shriveled balls of thread, and she was like, can I please take you clothes shopping?
You're the male stereotype.
But it was really books where if I was ever interested in a book, she was already grabbing the keys to take us to the Barnes and Nobles just down the street.
And I think you said something that's really important. And I don't know if John Williams had this experience with his mother, but she read books with us. And it went two ways. Like when we were reading Newbery Prize winners, whether that was My Side of the Mountain or The Giver or any number of other books, or whether she was she got me into the John Abrams series, which takes you through the history of the country from the Revolutionary War forward. And there's a lot of risque content in that. And she even said that going in, and it was eye opening for me. But she had read all those, excuse me, the John Jakes books, and she had read all of those John Jakes books, and she read them with me. And then when she would have book clubs, she would get me a copy of a lot of those books, and I would sit, kind of in the corner in a room and listen to the conversation. And sometimes I would even be able to offer something up, or I would, tell her before a book club, oh, you should, what did you think about this? And then she would say it in the book club, and then people would talk about it. And me, I'm like getting, yes, this is exactly what I wanted to hear the discourse on. But I've always been so thankful that we had a mother that was so book forward. And, even today, I really struggle to read books on a Kindle or anything like that. I love reading. I love turning pages. I love the stories and learning. And when I read books, the first thing I think about is God rest Mom's soul. I will read a great book and just wish I could call her and say, I'm sending you this book. You've got to read it next. And knowing that, when you do that with a lot of people, they're like, oh, yes, I would love to read the book you send me. But then they're not going to. But with Mom, she would have it read within a couple of days. And then she'd call you and say, we need to talk. I have 100 things that I want to ask you about this book. And then you'd have the most wonderful discussion.
It was always great. Some of my favorite memories are every single time a new Harry Potter would come out. We didn't just buy one copy. We bought two
multiple
at midnight launches. And it would be, traded around the house. We had multiple bookmarks in to mark where everybody was, but she was just so happy that we had that kind of collective journey together, and we could all talk about what was happening in the books as it was going on. And when
you go back home from college or something like that, you go to the bookcase and see what you had in there. We never had a ton of books because she was always giving them away to people, never selling them back or anything like that. But nobody gave away books more than Marjorie Ann Lovely Ceccarelli. You know what? I have a book for you. And then if she didn't have that book, a copy of it, she bought. She probably bought more. Amazon probably looked at Mom as a whale. They're like, do you realize there are like 15 books that she's bought 100 copies of each? Should we give her a discount? No. She's going to buy more.
Before Amazon, she probably kept half-price books in Oakbrook in business.
Easy. Okay, John, so with all of that, let's talk about one of our favorite authors of all time, John Williams. And no, we're not talking about the legendary composer John Williams, who was also a deeply integrated part of our childhood and upbringing. He is incredible. That's another story for another day. We're talking about the American author John Williams, who wrote two great American novels, Butcher's Crossing and then Stoner. We'll talk a lot about Butcher's Crossing today. We'll leave Stoner for another day. And then he wrote Augustus, which in many ways is a complete departure from his first two books, except in a couple of really key themes. And I'll wait for you to finish that book so we can talk about it properly. But who was John Williams? He was a flame in American literature that burned as brightly as any author that came before him, albeit not tremendously long in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, only 3 books, very spread out too. And he has the 4th one that he's, I always forget the word for it, disowned.
He's disowned, yeah.
Disowned it, but
we'll talk about that. Nothing But the Night.
It's remarkable to me, just the gap between his releases versus some of these prolific authors that are releasing 1, 2, 3 books a year. And the quality that he's slung out there is just top tier.
Absolutely. And so who was he? John Williams was born in 1922. He was born in Wichita Falls, Texas, and his family was part of the oil boom. His mother ended up remarrying his father, George Williams, whose name he took. And George Williams was a janitor in the local post office, so they didn't have anything close to a luxurious life as he was growing up. But they also were not destitute as many families during the Great Depression were. And, in that, his passion for reading was born. I think there are a lot of people who, living hand to mouth, maybe didn't have the same luxury of books and time and space to read, but he did. And in an interview that he had done at one point, he said the first praise that he had ever received in school was for his writing in 8th grade. And that really lit a fire in him to one day write for a living. And I think you and I know how that can be when you find something that you're very, very passionate about and you say, I want to do that one day. For me, it was sports writing. And I didn't end up being a beat writer for the Seattle Supersonics like I thought when I was a kid. But
R.I.P.
I
the
still write to
Supersonics.
this day. Yeah.
Yeah, R.I.P. the Supersonics. Sorry, that's all I had to say there.
Yeah, absolutely. So John Williams then graduates high school in 1939, just as World War II is beginning, but 2 years before the U.S. enters the conflict. He enrolls at Hardin Junior College in Wichita Falls, where he fails freshman English, reportedly due to boredom over the subject matter, all of which he had already covered in his personal life. And that's something that you had just talked about. One of the things that Mom had done is she exposed us to authors and books much earlier than our classmates. And oftentimes we would come across those same books later, and having read them, I think at times I would be bored with them, but more for me, I would read it a second time, fly through it, and then I always felt like, and I hate to say this, but like, the smartest person in the room, the most, able, person in the discussion. And I liked that a lot. But I can see how somebody like John Williams gets to junior college and he feels like he's, it's sort of like you think you're going into calculus 2 and everybody's like, well, we're talking algebra.
Well, and how many times do you see this with geniuses and visionaries of their craft that the traditional education system is not enough for them? They're that much of a cut above that they need something more, that going through that, normal standard process. And for him, this was junior college classes was not enough. People were not on his level. They were not challenging his way of thinking. They were not sparking the kind of conversations that he hadn't already thought through a thousand
Yeah.
times.
I mean, questions of the world and questions of life. And to your point, he drops out of Hardin Junior College, tries his hand at radio and some other odd jobs, and then his life changes when he joins the Air Force. At the time, the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1942. And that decision proved to be a catalyst for realizing his dream to be a writer. And it did start with that first book, Nothing But the Night, which he began writing while he was stationed in Calcutta, India. He comes to later disown that book, as you said, as well as a book of poems that he wrote, The Broken Landscape, which he published in 1949. He published Nothing But the Night 6 years after he started writing it in 1948. A year later, he publishes his book of poems. And then I think, like a professional basketball player who has a college career but then starts his professional career, and that's when his life as a basketball player really begins. I think for John Williams, after he publishes that book of poems, he starts writing Butcher's Crossing, and he matriculates to the University of Missouri, where he earns his PhD in English literature in 1954, and then goes back to the University of Denver, where he got his undergrad degree, to start teaching. And so all of this starts happening for John Williams, and a little bit more than 5 years after he returns to the University of Denver, we get Butcher's Crossing in 1960, his first great American novel.
And by my money, I mean, it's my favorite. You look at these three novels he wrote, and each of them is written in such a different and unique way. Butcher's Crossing encompasses roughly a year, end to end. It's very small, it's intimate, it's this unique look at the world in the American West. You look at Stoner and it's a lifetime, right? It's William Stoner from when he goes off to school until when he dies. And then, and that takes place generally at Mizzou as well, but a little bit stretched out from there. And then obviously, his third book is, first off, not told from a perspective, but it's told from artifacts, a series of letters and artifacts. And it's about Caesar and his
Augustus
world.
Caesar, yeah.
So I also have to respect the way that he approached each of these in a very different and unique manner.
Yeah, as I'm reading Augustus now for the third time, I think it's my favorite of the three. And I love Stoner. I love Butcher's Crossing. And I've been thinking a lot about that as we've been talking about doing this podcast. And I'm so excited for you to read Augustus. And I think for me, it's my favorite because it is it is excellence in a completely different genre. You know, it's like Bo Jackson. He was an incredible football player, and then all of a sudden he's also an all-star for the Kansas City Royals as well. It's, you know, what he did in writing Augustus for me cements the legacy. It's not a great American novel because it's not about America or the American dream or the American experience in any way, but the fact that he could depart from writing great American novels and to write Augustus is really, really incredible. So he writes Butcher's Crossing, you know, for my money, one of the greatest frontier novels ever written. It's set in the 1870s across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. We're going to talk a lot more about it. It explores the power of nature and spirituality. To me, it is the opposing forces of ambition and greed, innocence lost. We'll talk all about that and the experience told through the view of our protagonist, Will Andrews. And then, as I was saying, 5 years later, in 1965, Williams publishes Stoner, as you said, his second great American novel that's focused on the entire life of William Stoner. I found it to be incredibly moving and in many ways a painful narrative that details the fictional life of this professor. And if it's not in my top 5 of favorite novels of all time, it's right outside of that. You know, I think it's amazing that John Williams wrote for 12 years because 7 years later he publishes Augustus and then he's done. You know, I think that you talked about the frequency with which most great authors or the names that would come up in the discussions of the great authors of all time in America or by era. Oftentimes it does come down to volume, and he didn't write that many books and he didn't write for that long. You know, perhaps if he had spaced the books out every 8 or 9 years, more people would have known about him because of just exposure and being back in that cycle. But he was in the cycle from 1960 to 1972 and then didn't write again. And it was for that reason that a lot of his books didn't gain real acclaim until he had already passed in the 90s.
I mean, it reminds me a little bit of Magic Johnson, a career that burned very bright and obviously for very different reasons was cut short. But you also are always looking at that and wondering, man, what all could Magic have accomplished? And he's had a very successful career as an investor and an owner of franchises now. But like, you know, he's kind of the one in my mind that's could have been measured up against Jordan as one of the GOATs of all time. And I look at John Williams and wonder if he had kept writing. And I believe he stopped writing because his mind started to not be as tight as he would have wanted. And he didn't believe that he could continue writing at quality, which is one of my personal fears in life. That's like my biggest fear, if I'm being honest. So I get it. But you wonder what else we could have gotten out of that and what he would be remembered kind of in that more mainstream viewpoint of those great American authors.
Yeah, completely agree. So with that, let's dive into his first novel, Butcher's Crossing. As we discussed, this is a novel set in the frontier. It spans the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains. There are essentially 3 acts to this book. The first act, and all spoilers on the table, you know, hope you guys go read the book, but, you know, we're going to talk about all the different dynamics of the books and the characters, and so there's no way to do that without spoilers. But there are 3 acts in the book. The first act is when our protagonist, Will Andrews, arrives in Butcher's Crossing for the first time, gets, you know, his party together, or gets, you know, brought into a party that he's funding, and then goes out on his great, you know, Wild West adventure to hunt the buffalo. The second act is really once they are up in the mountains and the hunt happens and how Will changes. And then, of course, they get stuck for the winter, which was an incredibly arduous experience for all of our characters. And we'll talk about the core characters here in a second. And then the third act is them coming back into Butcher's Crossing and realizing that the world has changed while they've been gone, changed in tremendous ways. And it's a testament to how fast the world does change. It's very timeless in the nature of this theme of, you know, as the more things change, the more they stay the same, but they are always changing. And then, of course, we have our, you know, kind of what's next for Will Andrews, which isn't really, you know, an act so much as it is a discussion that we'll have on where Will goes from here. John, I've got three sets of core themes, and I'm curious if you agree with these sets or if there are any that you would add. The first one is the juxtaposition of hope and spirituality, or the relationship between the two. And I found that in the book, as you think through the different characters, there's almost an inverse relationship. The deeper the spirituality, the more that character was willing on to hold on to hope, even in the face of great adversity. I think the second of the themes is the counterbalance between greed and ambition, and when ambition can turn into greed, and what that means for the safety and security of everybody involved. And then the third, and this is one that you had brought up as we had talked about this, but the counterbalance between nature and innocence, and innocence lost through the experience of nature, and both the beauty of nature and the harshness of nature and everything that nature is in between. What do you think of those three kind of core sets of themes? And then is there anything else that you would add?
Those are all spot on. The very first one I would just add is it all comes down to faith and your faith in something and that ability to hold out hope as long as you don't lose faith. The second one's spot on in greed and ambition. The only other thing that I would say is just we get to live these through the eyes of the main character. Um, he comes in expecting this romantic experience based on what he had learned of the Wild West from poems that he had read before. And this is not a romantic Western novel. This is grounded in reality. And that was the intent from John Williams from the get-go is, no, this is what it really would have been like. It was hard. And every time Will accomplishes something, that's just the start of something else.
Yeah, it really is. And let's talk about our characters, starting with our protagonist, Will Andrews. Will Andrews was in his third year at Harvard, grew up in a Unitarian family. His father was a minister, so, and grew up in Boston. So grew up in the city, obviously plenty of connections, obviously a good student, got his way into Harvard, was succeeding, but decided that the life that was before him was not a life that fulfilled him, and felt a calling that he couldn't necessarily articulate. He couldn't necessarily even make sense of himself, but he knew that it didn't exist in Boston, and it existed where, so many kind of cliche American stories center. And it's the idea of the West, finding yourself in the West. Don't know what to do with yourself? Go West. And he does. He goes on this long journey from Boston, stopping in major multiple cities, because obviously he's not flying. This is well before airplanes. The train is still making its way across the country, so it's not like he can get on an Amtrak and chill out on his way there. He's got a pocket full of money, but he still has to endure this journey just to get to Butcher's Crossing, where he can begin his real journey, which is trying to find a party and a hunt.
Right, and he doesn't even know what he's looking for when he gets there. He gets there and he's asking around. I'm looking for some kind of.
Do you think that though, or do you think he's being coy? Because you're right. Like when he meets, our second character, McDonald, who is the trader who trades in the buffalo hides. McDonald says to him, "Are you looking for a hunt?" And he says, "No, not necessarily. I'm looking to understand the West and people who understand the West, and I want to learn." But it was always kind of obvious he was looking for a hunt. So my question comes back to, having read the book, like you have, did he actually not know what he was looking for when he arrived in Butcher's Crossing, or was he just not willing to say the thing out loud?
See, I took it as he was looking for something. I'm using my hand, something west. And that could have been an expedition, it could have been a hunt, it could have been something. And he went to McDonald because McDonald had serendipitously crossed paths with his dad 10 years prior. That's why he went to Butcher's Crossing. He wanted this to be this romantic, spiritual journey where he finds himself and finds something fulfilling, and, for him becomes that next level up of human, becomes a man. And for him, I don't believe he knew exactly what that encompassed Maybe he thought it'll be a hunt or something along those lines, but it'll be something Western. And he's looking for MacDonald to tell him what it is. And I think that comes down to, he's looking for a shepherd to lead him in his innocence as we meet him when he's entering Butcher's Crossing.
But he at least knew that he didn't want to be a paper pusher, because
Exactly.
McDonald gives him the job offer and says, I've got all of these hides I've got to treat. I hate doing all the paperwork. There were papers all over his office. And Will looks around and says, well, I don't want to do that. I thank you for the offer, but no thank you. Like, very clearly, no thank you. Who can tell me what these hunts are like? And then he goes and finds our third character, Miller. Now, before we get into Miller, I want to go back to our themes a little bit, and starting with Will Andrews. When we think about that first kind of counterbalance of hope and spirituality, or that spectrum of hope and spirituality, I think as we were talking about, he is seeking a spirituality. He believes that it's out there. He definitely has a faith and a spirituality to him. It's not necessarily like a Bible-based faith in God, although, he was raised in a Unitarian family. So he's not, at one point, he says he was surprised at himself at how little of the Bible he actually knew. He entered Butcher's Crossing, thinking he had a certain level of education on the Bible and religion, and only finding out through one of the characters that we'll talk about in a second that he didn't, right? But he is seeking that spirituality that growing up in a church didn't fulfill, that going to Harvard didn't fulfill, that whatever a corporate job in 1870 in Boston would have looked like wouldn't fulfill. And he comes full of hope that he's going to find that. Now, in the second theme, he's also very ambitious. I mean, he's coming and he's willing to put all of his inheritance. He has an uncle who passes away, leaves him, $2,000 and something dollars in money at the time, which today would be, obviously tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he's willing to put it all on the line to do the hunt, which is the micro, but the macro, the meta loop really is to go find himself. And so, he is nowhere near greed. He's all ambition, but we're going to find that his blind ambition, again, makes him blind to Miller's blind greed. And of course, nature and innocence, as you've said many times, this book is in many ways about his innocence lost, and the role that nature plays in each time you think his innocence is lost, another thing happens, and he gets another dose of nature-based reality that hardens him even further in this, grand scheme of things, short period of times that had to feel like many lifetimes from when he left Butcher's Crossing to when he returned.
Especially with all the hardships they endured in each kind of micro section of these acts. Fully agree there.
And then I think you have somebody like Miller, who, going through those same themes, has, very little spirituality. He even says, yes, you met me at your father's church. I was only there to find customers for whatever it is I was slanging at the time. And he is, I would say, high on greed. He's bought up all this land. He's very confident the railroad is going to come through, and so his ambition and his greed, he's like right in the middle of that spectrum. I think he's kind of equal parts both, and he has no innocence left. Like, he knows how hard the world is, and he's said that man's got to make it for himself. And so I think it's interesting that you have, again, this character with a very different mix of these qualities, very high on hope, but, no spirituality to it. He's a businessman. And it's interesting at the very end of the book, and we'll get to that, when he says, he basically says, what was I so hopeful for? You could never get the stink out of these things anyways. Like, it was a blind hope, right? You find with a lot of these characters, their sentiments are blind. And then you have, Miller, as we get into Miller, who is the hunter, right? And Miller has been in Butcher's Crossing for a while. And is he trying to recruit people to go on a hunt? Are people trying to recruit him? However it plays out, Miller purports himself to be the most seasoned, experienced, frontiersman and hunter in the land. And I think in many ways he proves to be that. But his complete greed and his complete lack of faith and spirituality and care for others nearly kills him. It's the juxtaposition of Miller. They would not have left without him. They would not have survived without him, but they almost died many, many times because of him.
He broke them into jail and then broke them out on several occasions, but ultimately, at the end of the day, he is the Western man's man that Will had dreamt up and idealized. And that's why Will was so eager to work with Miller, to follow him, and to attempt to learn from him. And yes, from a skills and a technical perspective, Miller fits that bill. The problem is, from a greed perspective and from a human nature perspective, he is that other side of the coin where he doesn't have that healthy respect for nature and the world and the environment and keeping things kind of coming around full circle. And we see
Yeah,
that.
and interestingly, the book gives us another character that serves as what is supposed to be Miller's conscience, right? But the whole point is that they're two different people. So you get to hear Miller's conscience through Charlie Hogue. Charlie Hogue is Miller's sidekick that's been with him for years. The last time they went into the Colorado territory, what happened? Charlie Hogue and Miller got caught in a blizzard. Charlie got stuck. Charlie lost his hand. So Charlie, who is obsessed with whiskey and is willing to do whatever Miller says, but will voice his concerns, constantly voicing concerns. But because he is on the spectrum of hope and spirituality, he has no hope, but he's completely spiritual. So he has a complete and total faith rooted in the Bible that Miller is his savior, and as Miller will protect him. Like, Miller is his Jesus in many ways. And he has this, again, blind faith in Miller that he will provide and that they will be okay. And it's interesting because even the experience that we go through in this story doesn't break that. Charlie is broken. Charlie comes in a half-broken human being, and he leaves a shell of a person. He can't even put together words. He doesn't even remember what he's been through, but he knows one thing, and like a dutiful dog, he follows Miller. And one other thing, no matter what Charlie says, it will never change Charlie's spirituality, Charlie's faith will never, through osmosis or any other means, get into Miller's core kind of fiber of being. It will never be a part of who he is. And so the juxtaposition of these two characters, to me, was perhaps the most interesting of the book. There are so many interesting character-to-character dynamics, but the dynamic between Miller and Charlie Hogue and Charlie's complete and blind faith, that really resonated with me.
You see outbursts from Charlie, and that's about it. And it's almost never like at Miller, it's at the situation that Miller caused, and it's like indirectly at Miller, but then Charlie just trusts Miller to get him out of it time and time and time again, and then that reinforces his faith.
Yeah. And so then there's two other characters that we should talk about before we get into the first act. And the first is the Skinner, Fred Schneider. So Fred's interesting to me because Fred is the voice of reason. And when you think about the spectrum of hope and spirituality, Fred is very low on hope. He's very low on spirituality. Everything is very black and white to him. When you think about the balance between greed and ambition, doesn't have a lot of greed. He wants to get what's his. He doesn't have a lot of ambition. He wants to be secure, and he wants his creature comforts in life. He's very honest about that. Even when they see all the buffalo in Act 2, he doesn't all of a sudden go, "You were right. Look at all the money we're going to make." He says, "Let's do the job we agreed we would do, and let's get out of here." And then when you think about nature and innocence, he loses some innocence. I mean, in fact, spoiler alert for the pod with no spoilers, or with all spoilers, as it were, he dies in the end. And so not only does he lose his innocence, but like this trip, he loses his life at the hand of nature. But he doesn't come in innocent. He comes in knowing full well he doesn't want to go, right? When he gets recruited, Miller recruits him from another town and doesn't even tell him where they're going, convinces him to come back to Butcher's Crossing, and only then does Fred Schneider learn what the actual plan is. And he says, "No, no, 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 not for me." And then Miller convinces him to go because how many opportunities are you going to have to make scratch? It's going to give you those creature comforts. And so, Fred Schneider individually, to me, is the most interesting character in the way that he interacts with the group, in the role that he serves as the voice of reason, and then ultimately the fate that he suffers in the end.
He's completely driven by logic and reason. He is the rational one there that is ignored time and time and time again. And he's the only one who took the guarantee instead of the upside. He was paid a salary on a monthly basis. It didn't matter how quickly they got the job done, it didn't matter how many hides they brought back. He wanted his guarantee, and that is why he wanted to get in, get the job done, and get back. That was his driving force.
And interestingly, that kind of brings us back to Will Andrews, who is funding this whole thing, and where Miller is trying to argue on Will's behalf to not do a guarantee. Will, who has no greed, he is so focused on seeking his spiritual realization and actualization of life that he's willing to just pay him the guarantee. Sure. And even when they're out there in the middle of a snowstorm and Fred Schneider says, "I need to get paid, homie," normally you'd say, what the hell are you going to do with that money? And even Miller does say, what are you going to do with that? And Will Andrews says, no, it's fine. Like, we agreed to this. We agreed to pay. That's the contract. Pays the man his money. Money that ends up getting washed away down the river when Fred Schneider suffers his fate, which we will talk about in a bit. But before we do that, let's talk about Francine, the last character of note in this book. Francine is in Butcher's Crossing when we depart. And Francine is one of the few people who are left in Butcher's Crossing when we return. Francine is a local prostitute. I believe she is German by descent. She speaks German. And, she is somebody that is taken to Will, and Will is taken to her in the first experience in Butcher's Crossing. But then as she tries to bed Will, not trying to take his money, very clear about that she sees a softness in him that, one, she doesn't see in Butcher's Crossing, and two, she knows is going to go away as soon as he leaves. She has no contemplation before he leaves that he's going to be gone for an entire winter. Nobody has that expectation. But she knows that however long he is gone, whether it is 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks in a worst case scenario, as Miller said, that he was going to come back a very hardened man. And yet, Will Andrews, who, we see his innocence, again, in that journey of innocence lost, he is full of innocence when he gets to Butcher's Crossing. And actually, he gets to the point where they're going to consummate this new relationship, or this new situationship, as the kids would call it today. He bails because his innocence overwhelms him, and he can't stand the thought of this woman betting him, who has betted so many other these hardened men that have come through. And yet, when he comes back, Francine still welcomes him back. And if not for Francine, I'm not sure that Will is able to process that lived experience in the same way and then set out again as he does at the end of the book. What do you think?
Francine was also what his kind of tunnel vision, if you will, pivoted to.
When we go back to hope,
that winter, and his hope.
What gave you hope?
Yeah, his hope pinned on Francine, and he wished he had gone through with it before he left, and she's what got him through it. And then he realized after that experience, and we're cut to the chase a little bit here, and we'll talk about this more once we get there, but she didn't fulfill him in the way that he was hoping, and moved on. And I also have to imagine that Francine knew that if Will was going to go spend time with Miller, of all people, there was no chance he was not coming back hardened. It was the two elements of man and nature, and nature was going to age him, but also learning from Miller over the course of any period of time was going to do that as well. People knew who Miller was in Butcher's Crossing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Will and how he arrives in Butcher's Crossing. As we mentioned, he makes a very deliberate decision to leave this life of comfort and predictability that he had. And, that's the first real action in this book that resonates with me, that feels timeless in many ways, because as humans, we talk about people who, work for a company for a really long time and they're miserable, and they've got those golden handcuffs and they don't want to walk away from a salary or a bonus or stock or whatever it is, but they're miserable. And it makes me think about an interview that you and I talked about from last week with a football coach, and they were talking about the difference between making a living and making a life. And I think, it's such a testament to Will Andrews as being one of those small percentage of people that's willing to give up that comfort and lay all of their security on the line in doing something completely different. And so often, we talked about John Williams and how, like so many great entrepreneurs and innovators, they'll get bored in the thing they're doing and they'll leave it. And I think, for so many people, it's hard to say what I really want to do is over there and then actually go do it. And yet that's what Will Andrews does. He picks up and he goes all the way across the United States in search of something, as we've said, he can't properly articulate, which is kind of crazy.
And he's putting his faith in people that he's either met once 10 years prior or never met before to guide him along the way when he gets there. That's the other part that's just kind of wild to me.
Let's talk a little bit about Butcher's Crossing when he gets there. And it is this bustling outpost where people are coming through to hunt. And, there were beaver pelts before it turned to buffalo. And, there's all of this hope and anticipation that the railroad is going to come through. And if the railroad comes through, it will turn into a real city. And, when Will gets there, I think his hope and his ambition for finding whatever it is inside himself he's trying to find is matched by the energy of Butcher's Crossing as being like the next big thing. And there's something to be said for that. I think, when I got to college and you feel the energy around you, like I thought I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know exactly like how to make the most of my college experience, but you feel a certain energy that is propulsive in many ways.
Yeah, I felt that same way. Started off as a business major, wound up computer science.
So Will Andrews, as we said, the first person he meets is McDonald. McDonald, vaguely remembers his father, but, in a show of real, I don't know what you call it. It's not sportsmanship in real brotherhood, I guess. It's just like man helping man. He does do what Will is asked, and he points him to Miller, who, instead of sending him out on one of McDonald's own expeditions, which I don't know, maybe that would have been the better thing. Will goes out hunting some of the, summer hides, as they talked about. The buffalo herds had been, broken up and were very sparse and were hard to track down, and you'd only get a couple hides at a time. But, McDonald could have pushed him in that direction and instead pushes him towards Miller, who, Miller actually does have the adventure that Will is seeking.
And there's so much mystique around it, right? And it's this element of when they first meet and they're first chatting, Miller and Will, Miller's almost like talking about it like it's too far advanced for Will. And he draws him in that way, but then also builds up the legend of this hunt, as well as the legend of Miller himself in Will's mind. He's building himself up to be this giant mountain of a man. And it will be the thing Will is looking for. That's going to be something they write books about, which obviously it was a book written about.
I completely agree. And, it's interesting how Will maybe feels like he's in control, but you definitely know that Miller's in control. Will's already made up his mind. So, he hands over the money, which is a great show of faith to Miller. Not that it's a big town, but in 1870, Miller could have gone anywhere with all of that money, and, Will could have never seen him again, and that could have been the end of the story. But it's not. Miller comes back because, as we learn with Miller, Miller is driven by one thing, his greed, and it's not a greed for money. It's a greed for the thrill of the hunt. And Will has given him a shot at doing something that I think we come to realize Miller maybe never thought he was going to get to do again, and that's go out on this hunt. And so, of course, Miller goes and gets the wagon, he goes and gets the oxen, he gets a rifle and a horse for Will. He makes it all happen. And I think, credit to Miller, they do have pretty much everything they need. Without that, Will would have been stuck.
Including a Skinner who's going to teach Will how to do his job in Schneider.
That's a great point. He gets Will a whole set of knives and gets Schneider, who, if anybody's going to be able to teach Will how to do this, it's Schneider. Now, of course, Schneider doesn't know until they're about to embark that he's also going to be teaching on this adventure. And when he finds out, he's none too thrilled about it. But again, he knows that on the other side of this, it's the money that leads to the creature comforts. And as we are reminded several times throughout the story, he is focused on one thing, and that is spending as much time in his life with creature comforts as he can. And he's not there right now.
And he's getting paid a very nice salary to go do that, right? Like, he's not getting paid chump change. He's getting paid solidly, and he's going to go do this thing, and he's going to go follow suit, and it's only going to be a few weeks, is what they were told.
Yeah, and they're saying, hey, it's going to be 4 to 6 weeks is what Miller first says. Schneider says, no way, it's going to be 8 weeks. And Miller says, even if it's 8 weeks, it'll be fine. And we're going to be back before the snow comes. We'll be back in Butcher's Crossing. We have a guarantee that Miller had lined up with McDonald's. So we're going to get $4 a hide for these hides. We can go collect up 1,000 or more hides. We're all going to be rich. And of course, Schneider, even in the face of that, he's like, just pay me my guaranteed salary. I'll give up all of the upside to know what my floor is going to be. And with that, they have an accord, and the group sets out. And the journey to the Colorado Territory ends up being far more arduous than any of them expected. And it starts with just how arid and dry the plains are. They talk about how there's very little water. It's, dried up in a lot of the creek beds, and where, they're putting their complete faith in Miller. Miller believes that he can take them on a shortcut that's going to get them to the Colorado Territory sooner, and it's going to keep them on the path of water. And unfortunately, the first big dose of nature-based reality is water's really important, and it's not everywhere you think it's going to be. And of course, they nearly run out of water. They get to the point where they have this big jug of water, and they're foregoing water themselves, and they're, to the very bottom of a dirty, muddy pool of water in their barrel, and they're soaking it up with rags and just dragging it on the oxen and the horses' tongues just to try and keep their tongues from swelling up so much that they suffocate and die. And at the last second, as they are, in dusk, they find water, and then they're able to stay with the water the rest of the way. But, Miller leads them into that danger for the first time. And then for the first time, Miller is the one that finds the water, and ultimately, they survive that first big challenge that they face.
We also see that Miller's going to withhold some things throughout the course of this story when Schneider keeps saying, well, we should just go back to the river. We should go back to the river. We should just go, that direction. And that's when Miller finally cracks, and he's like, well, we can't, because it's further to go to the river than it is to just push forward. And it's this,
I've been taking you on a different path than I've told you I've been taking you on. So we ain't where you think we are, and we're not as close to the river as you think we are. And boy, oh boy, you better keep following me. I mean, if you're Will, let me ask this question, because this also includes multiple instances where Miller will ride off in one direction or another, because he obviously, and of course, it's been 10 years. For the most part, once they get to the river, they follow it for a ways, and then there is no more trail. And by the way, they run across the railroad a couple of times, and which makes Schneider say, if the railroad's out here, people are out here. And if people are out here, haven't they already gotten to your buffalo? And so there are a lot of doubts that are starting to creep in. And I just wonder, Schneider, we know he was full of doubt. Could he get more full of doubt? But nothing was going to make him turn back because he cared about those creature comforts. But Will, we start to see that innocence lost. I wish you could be in Will's mind and know, at what point did his total faith in Miller start to fracture? It couldn't have been just that Miller was like, hang on, I got to go ride up a couple miles because it's going to be one of these turns and I don't remember which. But at some point, whether it was nearly all of them dying of dehydration, or just the amount of time it took to even see the crest of the mountains, at some point his faith had to fracture a little bit.
He didn't know what he didn't know, though. So for him, this may have just been, oh, this is what an expedition or a hunt is like in the Wild West. This is the gritty, harsh reality of being out, and this is what the cost is. This is what nature is, because, at every stage of this journey, he also was captivated at first by the beauty of nature and what he was encompassing, because he grew up in Boston. He grew up in a city.
And to that end, John, think about what that would have been like, a slow moving journey where you were going from the plains to the foot of the mountains into the hills and then into the Colorado Rockies. And I mean, they talk about it just before we get into part two, which we will call the slaughter. Um, Will and the group stand on this bluff up in the mountains as they're going up through the pass, and the air has gotten very thin, and they're trying to keep the wagon in place as they're going up these slabs of rock that, the buffalo have gone up and down a bunch of times, but, not built for man. And he turns and he looks back over the plains, and it's his first moment of multiple where he realizes what they've achieved in getting there. Now, he has no idea what still lies ahead. In many ways, it's like, hey, we made it. You didn't make it. You haven't made anything yet.
You're just on the
But
beginning of the next thing.
exactly. But, when he looks back, part of me has to think that sense of achievement is only made more grand and only felt more deeply if there was a fracture of confidence at some point. If there was a point where he was like, I actually don't know if we're going to survive. I can't leave, can't go do. And Fred Schneider says that a bunch of times. I'm just going to turn around and leave. And Miller's like, well, where the hell are you going to go? You don't know how to get back by yourself. And he says that honestly, but there's also a sense of condescension that, they all need Miller. Once they've gone, once they've committed to this, you're stuck with me. So, the first act of the book, a little slow at times, but for me, very powerful. And then it really picks up as we get into the mountains. They come up and over the pass and they look down in the valley. And just like Miller promised, it's a sea of black as far as they can see, winding all the way through the valley and then out, into various clearings, and just thousands and thousands of buffalo with thick hides. And this is a big thing, right? He, when he negotiated that $4 per hide agreement with McDonald, all McDonald was seeing were these thin summer hides. And the thinking is the thick hide would be, so much more attractive to the people out east who are wearing them to stay warm. And, nobody believed that they existed anymore. And here they are by the thousand, more than they can count. And Will has this moment where he is captured by the beauty and the power of nature. And he sits in that until Miller, who very quickly kicks into action. As they kind of get things set up, Miller then goes and gets all of the lead and all the bullets put together, and then goes and takes down the lead buffalo and says to Will, we're not even going to take the hide, but once you take down the leader, all of the rest of them calm down, and it makes the stand, which, anytime you stop and then you start shooting, that's a stand. And so Miller's goal was to get as many in a single stand as possible and then go from stand to stand, and thereby it started. And it was interesting to me how, very predictably, Will early on felt a sense of loss when the first buffalo goes down, and he starts seeing Miller shoot buffalo after buffalo, and they run and they kick and then they fall. And it isn't long until his sense of loss is replaced by a sense of strategy and trying to understand how Miller is going about the stand. And nature disappears from that, right? It becomes a game. And it all happens so fast. And it made me think, would it happen that fast for us? Like if you're Will and you don't know exactly what it is that you're seeking, but you know that it's in nature, and then all of a sudden you're doing all this destruction to nature, would the switch flip that fast that all of a sudden it's like, okay, this is the game now, and you're just fully focused on the game?
I do believe that it's two things there. It's the human condition that you are there to do a job, and he's captivated by these majestic beasts, and then he sees, the oldest, most proud, biggest son of a gun go down, and it's like, oh, it's like getting punched in the face, and then he becomes desensitized to it all because it is the job that they have to do, and that is the human nature of it. The second part of it is he's built up Miller and idolized him, And if this is what Miller's approach is and Miller's mindset is towards it, well, that's what it is to grow up. So, of course, he's going to be more keen and open to that desensitization and that push towards how do we, in the most optimized way possible, take down as many buffalo as we can carry, not realizing what Miller's ultimate goal was. And then they can get started on their journey back.
And I think part of it was just human nature. As you know, this group was damn near starving when they get into the mountains. They had very little food left and they didn't have fresh meat. And now all of a sudden, killing this buffalo doesn't just mean getting these hides, but it also means they're eating meat again and they're getting real protein again. And I'm sure just from a physiological brain standpoint, getting that protein back in probably kicks them back into that survival mode. And it's like, this is what we're doing. But that switch that he makes is really powerful. And, then they start going through the motions. And the goal is to be there for a few weeks and get 1,000 hides and then load them up, tall as can be on the wagon, and get out of Dodge. But that doesn't happen. And they start to see, as they're taking down more and more buffalo, that you can't even talk to Miller. Miller is shooting through the day. He's shooting into the night. And he's using multiple rifles, and doesn't matter how hot the barrels get. He hands it over to Will. Will's got to cool it and clean it and give it back and get him shooting again. And then they start to ask, Charlie Hogue says, you promised we wouldn't be here until the winter. Promised we wouldn't be here when the snow fell. And Fred Schneider is saying, we can't take all of these hides back with us. And of course, Will doesn't feel like he has a place to say anything and doesn't. But Will can definitely see that they're exceeding their quota and that they're starting to stray from their mission. And then all of a sudden that, pun not intended, snowballs. And Miller becomes so obsessed with killing and the greed of maximizing this moment for himself, everything else be damned, that they're there far longer than they expect. Because again, none of them can leave without Miller. Fred says a couple of times, I'm just going to leave. We have everything we need. I don't need the money anymore. I'm just going to leave. And Miller says, well, where are you going to go? How are you going to get back? And sure enough, as they're getting to the very end of the herd, the snow comes. And the snow doesn't come in 1 flake or 2 flakes or 10 flakes. It is a full-on blizzard. And they barely survive the blizzard. It is another instance where Miller's know-how, he breaks them into jail, but he also saves them by ripping straps off the hides, punching holes in 2 hides, tying them together, and then like a cocoon. And I can't even imagine this because these hides still have flesh on them. They're rotting. They've got flies. And it talks about that in the book, that as they are inside these hides, these 2 hides that are tied together, they're feeling things crawl on them. They're feeling the cold come in, and a blizzard, multiple feet of snow falls on top of them. And for days, they're only coming out to the blinding sky to relieve themselves and then right back in. They're not eating. They're, eating a little bit of snow to try and hydrate a little bit. And it is once they come out of that they realize, as they go look at the past, they are well and truly stuck. And it takes Miller saying the thing out loud again, that they're not going back in a couple weeks' time. They're there for the winter. And that's this harsh realization that if they thought running out of food and water on the way there was bad, getting through this winter, well, they'll be lucky if they leave with both their hands, as Charlie can attest.
And this is where Charlie starts to decline and his drinking kicks up pretty tremendously because he lived through this once before. He expressed multiple times that they needed to get out. And Schneider said this and threw these doubts up every time. He had to skin throughout the night while they were on stand after stand and hunting. And he would be really frustrated, but he would do the job he was paid for. And then this is where we see the relationships really start to fracture as well, as everybody is focused on just survival in their own way and getting to where the past is thawed out again.
Now, interestingly, it's a great point that you bring up because it does fracture the relationships and the party becomes a collection of individuals as opposed to, a well-oiled team as it was when they were taking down 100 buffalo a day during the hunt. they do come together, at least minus Fred Schneider, to build a shared shelter so that they can share their heat. Once they get out of that first blizzard, they're not back into the hides, but they use hides and they use whatever wood they can find to build this shelter. And Fred goes and does his own thing for the entirety of the winter. Fred is living his own existence just around the corner from them because he's so angry and upset that he let himself, that he let himself fall into what he perceives as a trap. He saw this risk coming and he fell into it. And to your point, that winter, the trip in tested their fortitude and their faith in Miller. The slaughter tested their faith and their sense of nature. And then the winter tests their sanity and their physical endurance. And it's all of those things that make Will into this incredibly hardened individual coming out of it. When we think about not just his hands and the clothing and not bathing for months on end, as at one point he goes in the river and cleans and he realizes that he hasn't bathed himself. But it is the collection of these experiences culminating in this winter where every day, and even at one point he comes outside and they had made blindfolds for themselves with little slits so that they wouldn't be blinded by the sun on the snow. And one day he goes out without it and he burns his eyes and he can't see for several days. And then finally does get his vision back and has to have that, realization of how important even all those little things are if you're going to survive this intact. And then of course it gets to the point where we're starting to get into spring and Act 3 comes and we're talking about a return. And of course Fred is trying to leave every single day and Miller's going and looking at the snowpack and coming back and saying every day, no, I'm sorry, we can't leave yet because the snow will collapse on us. And they're eating, more wild game. Things are better in the springtime. But they're still stuck there with all these hides. At least they have the hides though, right? They've got thousands of hides. They're convinced they can leave a bunch of them up there. They'll bring back the ones that they have. And then they'll come back and bring the rest back and they're all going to benefit. And finally, it's time to leave. And when the spring arrives and the pass clears, they get that wagon built up and they start the journey back. And for the most part, the journey back is relatively smooth. They knew the way, but the problem is they run back into the big river that they crossed so easily the first time when it was late summer. And if you've ever gone whitewater rafting or anything like that, once you get into like late July, the water levels are a lot lower, right? The runoff has happened from the mountains and it's not moving as fast. It's not moving as hard. They made their way through that river very easily. The second time they were coming back, you're talking about spring. You're talking about very cold water running very fast, much more deeply across a bed of rocks. And what happens? Well, they've got to get the oxen and they've got to get the wagon across. And so they decide they're going to go across as a caravan. Miller goes first. Again, Miller, no chicken, no coward. He goes first and shows that it's okay. He devises the whole plan and everything's going to plan until it isn't. And a big log is coming down the river and that log hits Fred Schneider's horse, takes both of them out and then takes out the wagon and they lose everything. They lose the oxen, they lose the wagon, they lose the hides, they lose the horse, and they lose Fred. And Miller, very matter-of-factly, as Will is in shock and Charlie is in shock, but not going to do anything. And Miller just says, there's nothing to be done. There's nothing we can do. He's gone. It's all gone. And of course, Miller, silver linings, we still have those hides back. And because I think it's pride. And you tell me, what do you think it is? Because why does Miller really care about the other hides at that point? He wasn't in search of money. He didn't need to go out hunting. He got what he wanted, which was killing all of the buffalo. So why does he care so much about, going back and making sure he still has the deal with McDonald and that he's going to hold him to that? Because that's the rest of the journey is Andrews and Miller limping back to Butcher's Crossing to make sure that McDonald will still pay them for all the hides that they have stashed up in the mountains. What do you think?
Because nobody wants to be a monster, right? And I think Miller deep down knows that the destruction of this entire majestic herd was unnecessary and was to just satisfy his bloodlust. And having the hides and having the business end of this is that psychological justification for there was a reason we went and did this. I was hired to lead this hunt for Will. It wasn't me doing this. It was Will that led to this. And I'm not a monster. I was just the hired gun. And also just that hope bringing there on the end of the string, like what is next for him after he's completed this? Like he's always on to the next thing. When you look at Miller, and every time he breaks themselves back out of jail, there's that next quest to conquer. And now that the buffalo are gone, what's next for Miller? Well, he's got to go back and get those other hides and make sure that this deal is still on the table.
Yeah, and he doesn't have the money. And even if he did, he'd have to go get another wagon. He'd have to go do the whole thing over. And, it really is fascinating to me how, Miller turns as an individual. He goes from being so steely. And, as they talk about in the book, he goes months without talking and he just grunts and he's just in the zone, getting them through this situation. And then they get back and it's no show. Miller is furious with what's happened, but they come back to a changed world. First, it's not just Butcher's Crossing. That's the micro of it, right? Butcher's Crossing is largely deserted. It's become dilapidated. The hotel that Will stayed in and the bar are being run by a guy that just came into town, and the owner left and said, as long as you mind the bar and the hotel, you can stay here for free. And so, Will gets his hot water and, goes back upstairs. And then, of course, they go to find McDonald, and McDonald isn't there anymore. The brine pits where McDonald had all of his hides, the hides are stacked up and the brine pits are deserted, and they go seeking McDonald, Miller and Andrews, and they find him. And McDonald is the one that tells them it's not just Butcher's Crossing that's changed. Nobody wants buffalo hides anymore. And he makes that, infamous remark that, we probably should have seen this coming because you never could have gotten the stink out of him anyways. And then he says to Miller, really, this is your fault because you did the same thing you did with beaver pelts. As soon as there was a taste for beaver pelts, you killed every single beaver there was. And then as people moved on, which they always do, and the market is met, there were all these beaver pelts left over, and that's where we are. And, of course, Miller says, I'm going to hold you to this. And he says, hold me to what? I don't have anything. Do you want my properties? You can have them. Do you want the pelts? You can have them. You can have whatever you want, which, of course, we find out very quickly was a little disingenuous. It was a little bit of a bluff because Miller takes him up on that, and in the night goes back to the brine pits and sets everything on fire, torches all of the bales of hides, and everybody that is left in Butcher's Crossing comes down to this toxic plume of smoke, and Miller riding in and out of this fire on his horse, yanking the different bales of hides into the fire where they're exploding into flames. Yeah, and McDonald comes down in his pajamas from where he was staying in the little guest house, the little shack behind the hotel, and he's shocked, he's crushed, and as he says, it wasn't because they were worth anything. It was just because it was all I had left in this world.
They were his.
It was the only thing that I still had that was mine. And Miller, again, just out of such greed and just the pinnacle of selfishness, decided that if this agreement wasn't going to be upheld for him for reasons that were Miller's fault, if Miller had gotten back, as McDonald said, if you'd gotten back when you said you were going to get back, I had the money and I would have bought the hides, but you didn't.
The market hadn't crashed yet. Yeah.
The market hadn't crashed yet, but you didn't, and here we are. And then Miller decides to take it out on McDonald, and it's such a reflection of who Miller is and how his world revolves around he and himself, and everything else is a pawn or a tool to be used.
Yeah, and the railroad had been built at a town 40 miles away, so all of the hope and, forward-looking confidence was misplaced, and we see that happen with McDonald, and just one thing after another compounds, and he's absolutely crushed. Where Will, on the other hand, comes back, and the thing that's been keeping him moving forward throughout this whole snowstorm and this whole ordeal is
Francine.
Francine, and he goes to find her.
Hmm.
And
Which he's the only one with hope left over because Fred is dead. Miller's lost all of his hope. There's no more buffalo for him to kill. He has nothing to hunt next. McDonald has lost all hope. His business has been ruined. Charlie Hogue is no longer even a human being anymore. He can't put together sentences and he doesn't remember the experience they went through. Will Andrews tries to talk to him in Butcher's Crossing, and Charlie starts saying, Miller went to go get a wagon. We're going on a hunt to the Colorado territory. It's like the whole thing had been wiped and he had been sent back to before the trip had begun. And that's where his head was. And it's crushing to see that, his hope and everything has been taken from him. The only one that has hope left is Will Andrews. And to your point, he doesn't move on right away. He actually spends some time sitting in it with Francine and being wrapped in her safety and her security, but then realizing that it wasn't this hunt that was going to fulfill him spiritually. Certainly wasn't going to be going back to Boston. It wasn't the arms of a woman. He wasn't just looking for a partner. He didn't know what it was, but we end the book with Will setting off again to the West on his own rather than returning to his life of privilege, still in search of whatever it is that's going to fulfill him.
and once again, he doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know where he's going. He's just going looking for that next big thing.
John, I want to ask you what your biggest takeaway was, because for me, it was all about being in the moment. It was about being aware of your surroundings, like don't live with blinders on, but be in the moment, right? And this idea, Jim Carrey talked about this, that it doesn't matter how rich and famous you are. At some point, you are going to realize that it's not about that. Life's not about that. Life's about relationships and people and connection. And it's about helping others and being a part of other people's story. And I think, for me, this book really reinforced that it is about experiences. And sometimes it's about really relishing them and soaking them in. And sometimes it's about surviving them and being better for it. But that this idea that you're going to find something, like that's the thing. I don't know if Will's ever going to find a thing that makes him go, oh, this was it. I think he will find what we all find as we get older, that it's not about the things, but it's about the people and it's about the moments and it's about being present.
That resonates in a big way, and that definitely hit me. I would say the thing that I took away the most is there's always a next step, and you need to appreciate what it took to get where you are and what you've accomplished, but also recognize you're never done. And there's always another journey and there's always another challenge, and we are constantly growing and learning and becoming more experienced, more seasoned, and better people. And it dovetails really nicely with one of my favorite lines from, funnily enough, the Witcher books, and it's something ends, something begins. And that's true with every chapter in life, except for when you croak at the end, and depending on your belief system, something ends, something begins. But, when you finish high school, something ends, something begins. When you start your first job, when you retire, you're on to the next journey.
And anytime you get onto a new journey, mom would always say this to us. The beautiful part about life is you have these chapters and these seasons and these journeys. And if you are willing, you will learn from all of them. And then the next one that you get to start as the best version of yourself, a version of yourself that has benefited from all of those lived experiences and is more ready for the next thing as a result.
Absolutely. She was always so wise like that. And here's to hoping that Will marching off with everything he's learned from nature, the experiences, and the technical components from Miller, is able to go take all of that as the best version of himself and go do something incredible.
Absolutely. John, thank you so much for this conversation. I would love to get back together over winter break and do our discussion of Stoner. I would also love to send you my copy of Augustus if you don't have one yet, and I would love for you to read that. I think you're going to be blown away by it, and I think that's going to be a very different type of discussion because if you're anything like me, you're going to be writing down names of all of these people in Greek history or in Roman history, and you are going to be looking them up, and it is incredible the historical accuracy with which John Williams wrote that book. So definitely dive into it. Let's come back together for Stoner. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a happy holiday. I hope you're all getting into not just some fun stuff, but a ton of fun stuff. If you're not having fun during the holidays, when are you having fun? Everybody have a great day. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. We will see y'all again soon.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays, y'all.